introductions. All right, so hello everybody and welcome to Law at the Library, a partnership between the Chicago Bar Association, the Evanston Public Library, and the Chicago Public Library. My name is Lorena Neal. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the legal literacy librarian at the Evanston Public Library. We're delighted to have everyone here tonight in advance of Earth Day for this presentation on environmental law affecting your community. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format for this evening, and then we will get things started. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will introduce you to our three presenters. They will then give the presentations, followed by a question and answer period. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, please type them into the Q&A window, which you will find near the bottom of your screen. And you can also use the chat feature to ask your questions. I'll collect your questions as they come up and give our presenters the opportunity to answer them at the end, or rather, Lynn, our moderator, will do so. So feel free to add your questions whenever you think of them. And if you have any technical issues or questions, feel free to direct those to me in the chat as well. Our next Law at the Library session will be on May 20th. The topic will be LGBTQIA+ and the law, transgender rights. I'll put the link to register in the chat for everyone. In the meantime, you can always see videos of previous presentations on the Evanston Public Library YouTube page, and I'll post a link to our playlist in the chat as well, in case you're interested in that. And we also have at the EPL website a list of general free and low-cost legal resources, which I will link for you in case you're interested. Our moderator tonight is Lynn Grayson. Lynn is an environmental lawyer with the woman-owned boutique law firm of Nyman Franzetti, LLP, and has spent her career practicing environmental law in Illinois, both with government in Springfield and in private practice in Chicago. She's the past president of the Chicago Bar Association, and one of her favorite community outreach initiatives is the Law at the Library program series. She's participated in several, or maybe all, of our environmentally focused programs. So we're thrilled to have you here tonight, Lynn, and I will turn things over to you.
Perfect. Lorena, thank you very much. We appreciate your help and your support as always. Special thanks to you and to the Evanston Public Library and to the Chicago Public Library, and of course to our much beloved Chicago Bar Association for hosting this collaboration in the Law in the Library series. I'm delighted to participate in another one of these relating to environmental updates in our community. This program celebrates Earth Month and the upcoming Earth Day on April 22nd. This year's Earth Day 2026 theme is Our Power, Our Planet, emphasizing the environmental progress that is driven by collective daily actions from individuals and communities as opposed to national organizations and/or even governmental entities. This year's theme emphasizes responsibility, both personal and collective accountability, daily decisions, conscious choices that we make, be it in our diet, consumption, or energy use, as well as long-term impact with a focus on sustainable systems and future generations. Today's program, in keeping with this theme, will discuss some environmental issues and matters impacting Chicagoland and the communities where we live and work. Also, the program will offer some insight into key environmental entities that have authority and jurisdiction in Chicagoland and Illinois, how to stay informed about environmental issues in your community, the importance of public participation and outreach, and opportunities to get more involved in your community, including best practices for using FOIA to obtain environmental data from governmental authorities such as US EPA, IEPA, and possibly local entities like the City of Chicago, Cook County, or even the Illinois Pollution Control Board. To lead our discussion this evening, we have an exceptional, wonderful group of speakers, each of them with experience serving in environmental leadership positions with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency, the City of Chicago, and the Illinois Pollution Control Board. I have known and worked with each of these individuals and so appreciate their support in being a part of this program this evening. Our first speaker is going to be Rhett Nelson. Rhett is a retired EPA Region 5 here in Chicago Regional Council and now a board member at the Friends of the Park in Chicago. Our second speaker is going to be John Kim. John is an of counsel with Brown, Hayes, and Stevens in Chicago, and the former director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And our third speaker is Jennifer Burke, the managing partner at KBC Law Group in Chicago. Jennifer is a former board member of the Illinois Pollution Control Board and a former senior counsel for aviation, environmental, regulatory, and contracts in Chicago's law department. I specifically reached out and asked each of these individuals to speak today. They all have extensive governmental service experience. They're the perfect team to talk a little bit about environmental issues in our community, how you can get more involved in the importance of your participation in our community. With that, I will turn it over to Rhett to get us kicked off.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Lynn. And I think the first order of business is to try to get my my slides shared. So let me do that. If Lorena is on, she can tell me whether I've done that successfully.
You have been successful.
Excellent. That's good. Well, I want to launch right into it because the worst thing that I can do is interfere with the other distinguished panel members and the folks who want to ask questions at the end. So I'm just going to get going. I really wanted to talk about three different things. One is, what's the motivation to get involved around Earth Day activities? And if I do want to get involved, who might I be engaging with? And third, what legal tools might I have available to kind of further that effort? So for a little bit of inspiration, I turned, of course, to Aldo Leopold. I'm not going to read the quotes aloud. I do think that this resonates with what Lynn was saying about personal responsibility, that essentially, if you're looking towards land health, let's understand what that is and figure out how to conserve, because really that stewardship for future generations is really what we want to do. And the second quote there, this endeavor is constant, kind of like ultimate perfect justice. We're never going to get there, achieve absolute perfect justice or harmony between people and land. But we got to keep going. And nature is all around us. I pulled this quote from Scott Momaday, who I think that even in this pretty urbanized environment that Chicagoans and Evanstonians live in, there are bits of nature, fragments perhaps, but all around you. So whether it's the flowering tree that you see on the way to the bus stop, or, the neighbor's garden that you see on your walk to the barber shop. Not that I have a whole lot of need for that, but, engage, observe, and wonder, because it's a wonderful world. I kind of grouped this into kind of various hierarchies, if you will. Not necessarily in orders of importance, but just it helps me mentally kind of structure this. There's the local level. If we're not talking about government, I'd talk more about park advisory councils. There's a very long list that you could come up with. Regional groups, kind of like the statewide groups, like Open Lands is Illinois based. A number of kind of groups with a larger focus. And then, of course, there are the national groups like Sierra Club and the Nature Conservancy and US EPA that I'm going to talk a little bit about. I think one of the things that I find fascinating about the environmental endeavor, if you will, is the folks with whom you get to engage. And so, everybody has a slightly different agenda perhaps, but together we can achieve real results. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on how EPA is structured and so on. When people think about federal environmental law, often US EPA is the first agency that people think of. mainly because it's the principal implementer of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and the Superfund Cleanup Law and a host of other, the kind of alphabet soup of other federal environmental statutes. And so it really is kind of the main entity there on the federal level. But an important note to make is that there are many other players on the federal level. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service handles wildlife import smuggling of threatened species and so on. Department of Energy handles nuclear waste. So don't be tricked into thinking that EPA is the only game in town. U.S. EPA is the only game in town, because it's certainly not at the federal level. Not to mention the fact that there are state and local agencies that are as or more engaged than the federal folks may be. Last US EPA slide, the Region 5 office, which I was in for 36 years, covers the upper Midwest states. They're obviously pictured on the screen there. The website is there. Lorena is going to post these slides, I think all of our slides, in the chat. So don't feel like you have to madly write everything down. You can click on the website after we finish up. And I guess one point to make on this slide is it's not just the states with whom US EPA engages, but the 37 federally recognized tribes that are sovereign governments, and we engage in a government-to-government kind of relationship. I want to kind of put the opportunities for public engagement into two buckets. One is what's happening when the agency actually takes an action and is engaged in kind of the formal notice and comment period process. And then secondly, maybe just as importantly, when the agency hasn't necessarily engaged yet, or you're not sure whether they have, there's ways to find out through the Freedom of Information Act and some other information sources. And I'll mention, back again to that first bucket, the administrative processes when an agency is undertaking action. These are all situations that have relevance for us here in Chicago. So, for example, under the Clean Water Act, there are discharge permits, what we call NPDES permits. U.S. Steel in Indiana comes to mind. The effluent there may or may not have an impact on Evanston and Chicago, and we're not going to debate that here. But so when those Water Act permits come up for renewal, or if new ones are issued, there's a very formal process by which the draft permit is made available for public comment. There's often a public hearing, a defined way to submit comments, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that process in a bit. Superfund is a quintessentially kind of federal law to clean up toxic waste sites. I should note, though, that of course the state has very similar authorities, but it is a separate authority that's very similar and accomplishes many of the same things. There are Superfund sites in Chicago. The Acme Steel Coke plant was just added to the national priorities list in 2024. Cyanide, mercury. This is at about 111th near the Calumet River and the Big Marsh wetlands. Some contamination that threatens those water bodies. The Lake Calumet cluster is a number of Superfund sites at the biggest lake in Chicago, Lake Calumet. So this has real relevance for folks living in the nearby area. And I'd also point out that the National Environmental Policy Act, which is all agencies have to adhere to, not just US EPA, when there's a major federal action significantly affecting the quality of the human environment, then what most folks are familiar with is the environmental impact statement process. Unless you think that would never happen here, the Morgan Shoal, which is along the lakefront between the museum campus and Jackson Park. There's a revetment of the limestone kind of blocks there and some erosion control. So the Army Corps of Engineers actually just closed a public comment period at the end of March and is in the process of making a final decision there. So, and there was a very active community that got involved, and there's some significant comments that were raised. So we'll see how all of that turns out. I do have some tips for folks that are submitting public comments. This is kind of from the perspective of having been on the receiving end and kind of going through the comments and trying to decide and seeing which comments are the most impactful and which are most likely to sway the agency from the draft decision or the proposed action that it's put out for public comment. If there's something, it can't just be, I don't like it. It's or the penalty's too low. If to the degree that the commenters can come up with a concrete, specific action that hasn't been considered or has been somehow misunderstood, or especially important, especially if you're trying to persuade a court that something has gone awry, if the agency didn't follow the correct process, they didn't actually get notice to everybody that needed to get notice and so on, then these are real, significant impacts that should cause an agency to take pause. And if they didn't, a court may ask them to pause and consider. Submit whatever information you've got. The agency has to consider and respond to all the comments before it makes its final decision. So, and if you don't think that your comments were responded to adequately, then there is an appeals process often, and or you can go to court. Excuse me. The last thing I wanted to mention was the Freedom of Information Act. Government entities have to be as transparent and open as they can be. Just bear in mind that they have to balance that against some legitimate government interests and people's privacy rights. So, for example, often if there's an ongoing, especially criminal investigation, it would not be in the government's or the public's interest to disclose, the list of witnesses associated with that, or some of the strategy that goes into developing that case. Similarly, as to people's privacy rights, we don't need to disclose people's social security numbers, and there are some things that really shouldn't be released. It's not complete openness in that the opportunity that you have to get information from the agencies are to obtain records. Records are defined broadly, so it's not just paper documents, it's electronic recordings and videos and all that stuff. But the government is not required to create new documents in order to respond to a request. So you're only going to get documents that are in existence when the request is made. And if there isn't a document in existence that gets to the precise thing that you're interested in, then FOIA is not going to be your solution, unfortunately. Often you can get these documents photocopied for you. There is kind of a limit on the number of pages and kind of a charge after that page is reached. But if cost is an issue, you can arrange for an in-person review of documents, or you can seek a fee waiver if your request is in the public interest. And that actually happens fairly often, especially when it's a member of the press that is seeking the information. Your name and the nature of your request is public information, so just kind of bear that in mind. But again, some tips if you're going to engage in this arena. I mean, the best way to get information about what an agency is doing is to look at their website or other publicly available information to see if it's already out there. Because while there are specific time limits and deadlines by which the governments need to respond, why take, there are delays. I think I looked on the US government FOIA site, and even the straightforward comments or requests are taking 30 days. So that's, why wait if you don't if the information is already publicly available? Actually, they're not even going to give you that information. They're just going to point you to the website. One thing, though, that if your information is something that only the government has and you want it, I heartily recommend that you engage with the FOIA requesting office, because they can help you develop search terms or kind of help pinpoint what information may be available right away and can be released, earlier than the rest of perhaps the documents that may take time to review and decide whether, in this government balancing, some of the documents need to be redacted or withheld. So you can kind of phase responses in order to get a quicker response. But again, I think figuring out what the best approach is. I actually had a great, and I think this is an environmental issue. There's a vacant lot behind us with actually a lot of great fireflies, and it was lovely. A house was ultimately approved, or the lot was sold. There was definitely concern about a zoning waiver that was associated with the new house that would go up there. And so the neighbors were interested in making sure that the building permit conformed to the waiver that had been granted. And actually direct engagement with the City of Chicago building department was quite useful, because some of the information they were going to withhold, we didn't actually want that information. So to engage directly, you can speed it up and also avoid getting needless paper that you're not particularly interested in. And the best way to do that, maybe bullet number 6 is the most important. The best way to do that is to engage with government bureaucrats as if they're real people wanting to do a good job, because they are. And I often think that you get better results by engaging respectfully and helpfully. And of course, the same is true. That's the way government employees should be engaging with you as well. But I think that goes a long way. And it's sometimes a lesson for all of us lawyers that we in the legal community can engage with each other in the same way. Since this is a library presentation, I wanted to leave you with a reading list. These are some of the greats that I've read in the last 6 months, which I took out all of which I took out from the library. This lakefront one, Public Trust and Private Rights in Chicago, is a bit of a slog and maybe more of interest to lawyers who want to find out more about the evolution of the public trust doctrine, which actually started in Chicago along Grant Park. And there's some other books, Life and Death of the Great Lakes by Egan, that Lorena and I were just talking about, that could be here but didn't get there. Get engaged and do something positive. So that's it from me. I'll stop sharing and turn it over to, I think, John.
Yep. Rhett, thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. John, you're up. And I just wanted to let everyone know we do see a couple of questions coming in. We're going to let all of our speakers share their thoughts and comments, and then we'll take questions at the end.
Thank you. So once again, I'm on that technological tight wire. And are my slides up?
They are, John.
Fantastic. Okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. And I think it's a great opportunity for libraries to collaborate with the Chicago Bar Association and hopefully bring some insights and some perspectives that might not otherwise be readily available. I had the benefit of seeing Rhett's slides before I finalized mine, because Rhett is much more timely than I am. So I tried to avoid some of the topics that he did a very good job on, specifically including FOIA. I will say that the guidelines and the references that he made to FOIA are equally applicable at the state level as they are at the federal level. So certainly I couldn't do a better job than he did on those. I will focus my time on the interaction and the workings of the at the state level. That's what I have the most direct experience with. And I will start, as most lawyers probably do, with the law that frames the environmental law in an environmental regulation in Illinois. And that is a statute called the Illinois Environmental Protection Act. I gave the citation just in case anyone's really interested in reading a very long piece of legislation. But I think it's important that at the very beginning, in the mission statement of the legislation, one of the provisions is that the General Assembly, and when they enacted the legislation, acknowledged that one of the important components of environmental law in Illinois and what this legislation was intending to do was, among other things, increasing the opportunities for public participation. And that is the theme that I think Rhett did a great job of, and I'm going to continue, which is what are the avenues and what are the best means and opportunities for public interaction with a governmental entity that oversees and conducts environmental regulation. And so I'm going to, again, I will specifically be focusing on how the Illinois EPA conducts that work. And that agency does a lot of different things. But for the purposes of this conversation tonight, I'm going to limit it to really three areas. The first area is enforcement. And, you know, by its nature, what that means is when there are instances of alleged violations of the Illinois Environmental Protection Act or the regulations that are part of that act, then the Illinois EPA has a process that they work with that allows them to bring enforcement cases against alleged polluters, both civil and criminal actions, and then ultimately will work with they will either resolve a case themselves or they will work with an office such as the Attorney General's office, or if they are working in conjunction with the federal government, with US EPA, potentially with the Department of Justice, to actually bring those cases to court if necessary. And the way the enforcement law is set up and the provisions in the act are set up, the state has a broad ability to interpret and apply those laws when they conduct enforcement actions. The whole point behind the Environmental Protection Act is to err on the side of being protective and conservative, and working towards conservative in the sense of erring on the side of trying to be as protective of human health and the environment as possible. Now, with enforcement cases, a lot of that interaction takes place between the state entities such as the Illinois EPA or the Attorney General's office and the alleged violator. However, there are opportunities or there are instances where public involvement and public sentiment are a key part of what happens. One good example is a vast number of cases that are subject and brought as enforcement cases are initiated because of public complaints, because someone has seen something, has heard something, has smelled something that they believe is a problem, and they have reached out, they've taken action, they've contacted, in the case of the Illinois EPA, they've either contacted one of our regional field offices or the agency's headquarters and basically said, hey, you know, you can do it anonymously, but I have seen something, and you can do this online too. You can describe what you've seen, what you've heard, what you've smelled, and you can submit a complaint. And that complaint will be reviewed. And if it looks like it's something that needs to be investigated, then the Illinois EPA will send out their field staff to go and conduct an investigation. And if that inspection turns out that there are problems, that there is some kind of violation, then they will begin that formal enforcement process. So a lot of cases are begun because people in the public, citizens, neighbors, what have you, have seen something and have taken the step to go ahead and report that. Another way that public involvement and public sentiment is relevant, there's no formal process that in the ways that I'll describe it in the next situations, for someone to say, well, I want to become directly involved in that lawsuit that the state is bringing against somebody. But there are certainly opportunities for people to express their opinions, to raise concerns, to reach out to the Attorney General's office, to reach out to the Illinois EPA and to say, I'm very concerned about what's happening at this facility, or I'm very concerned about what this person is doing. And although that's not necessarily a specific part of that legal process, it's also not something that's going to be ignored. It is something that will be taken into consideration. And that's because, again, among other things, the whole purpose behind the Environmental Protection Act is to be responsive to the public and be responsive to the environment. The way this law is set up, it doesn't really provide for what we would call private remedy, which is, oh, something's happened and some damage has happened to my house, so I want someone to come and repair my house. It doesn't really go specifically towards that. It goes more towards remedying the cause of the problem. But having said that, oftentimes when there is a remedy to that underlying problem, that will have an indirect or direct benefit to the people who are potentially going to be affected by that. So there's definitely opportunities for people to express concerns over operations, conditions, what have you, that they find concerning, and those are definitely sentiments that are taken into consideration. The next area that the Illinois EPA engages in that has a lot of opportunities for public engagement more directly is permitting. And permitting is a specific tool that the Illinois EPA uses that governmental entities such as EPA, Illinois EPA or US EPA use as a specific means to impose requirements upon an entity for a certain type of activity that they're conducting, and then to police them through that permit. And then also, if they are not complying with that permit, to use that permit as the basis for a potential enforcement action. So permits are really the direct means by which regulatory oversight of operations, facilities, activities, how those happen. At Illinois EPA, they have air, land, and water programs that have very specific permits that are associated with those programs. Many of the permits that happen at the state level in Illinois, and for that matter nationwide, are permits that have a federal basis. So Rhett mentioned an NPDES permit, which is a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. And what that basically is it's a federal permit that addresses discharges into waters of the state or waters of the United States from something called point source, which means sort of an end of a pipe. So if you have an operation, an industrial operation, if you're a wastewater treatment plant, what have you, and you are discharging into a waterway, you have one of these permits, these NPDES permits. Now, many states, such as Illinois, have an agreement with US EPA whereby US EPA will provide some funding and oversight to the state, and then the state will actually be the entity that administers that permit program. So the state will issue NPDES permits on behalf of the federal government, and the state will be able to enforce those. The federal government will be able to enforce those. But the program for that permit is coming from largely from provisions in the Federal Clean Water Act. There are provisions at the state level that will mirror or enhance those requirements. The general rule is, in terms of how you can regulate activities, you can be more stringent at the state level, you just can't be less stringent. So you can have situations where a state will be a little more stringent or a little more prescriptive in certain types of activities than would be done at the federal level. But again, when you have those permits and programs that have a federal derivation, then there are obligations to the public that you have as part of those things. And the Illinois EPA at the state level conducts a tremendous amount of outreach in association with those permits. They do that through public notices, through public hearings. When generally speaking, there are different types of permit transactions. There are different sort of tiers and levels of permits. For example, in the Bureau of Air program, depending upon how much emissions you are talking about, how complicated your operation is. So it's sort of tiered in terms of the most complicated permits to the least complicated permits. And depending upon the type of permit, there might be it might be that the Illinois EPA will issue, regardless of what is going on, if it's a certain type of permit, they'll issue a public notice. And what a public notice does is basically tells the public, hey, we've received an application for seeking a permit for this activity. We have reviewed it. We have determined that what they are asking for meets the requirements of the law. We have prepared a draft permit that we propose to issue to this entity. Here's a copy of that draft permit. And we're now opening this up to public comment. And we're going to leave this open for a specified period, 30 days, 45 days, what have you. And we're allowing you to submit comments in response to that draft permit. This is where Rhett's comments in terms of how you might want to tailor those public comments is really helpful, because as he said, certainly at the state level, all of those comments are read, all of those comments are considered. And it is a very common thing for comments that have come in to be considered, and then changes to the permit based upon changes to the permit happen based upon consideration and a decision that, yes, there is something to that comment that makes sense. Let's make a little adjustment to the permit to try and reflect the fact that we agree that there's maybe, you know, why can't you do this, or have you thought about this, or what about this approach instead? So that is a common thing. So that's why it's very important for those comments to be as thoughtful and as comprehensive as possible. In certain instances, there will also be a public hearing. Public hearings, in some cases, are mandatory. Some cases are what they call discretionary. At the state level, the Illinois EPA director has the authority to require a public hearing in certain cases that that the director believes that there is a sufficient level of public interest in a matter, in a transaction. And so a public hearing is a little different than a public notice. Public notice allows you to submit written comments and say, I'd like you to consider these following things. The comments are reviewed. In many cases, something called a responsiveness summary is prepared that responds to all of those comments. A lot of times comments are similar, so they might be grouped together, but all the comments get responded to. A public hearing is a situation where, sort of as the name suggests, you actually are now conducting something in person. There will be a notice as to, you know, there will be a public hearing at 7 p.m. at ABC High School in the gymnasium. And this draft permit will be the subject of that hearing. And so people can come and they can give now in person their verbal comments or their verbal thoughts or their verbal questions on that permit. And those comments and questions and what have you will all be transcribed and will all be then, just the same way as a written comment will be taken into consideration. Those verbal comments will also be taken into consideration and made a part of the record that is relied upon by the Illinois EPA in whatever permit decision they actually made. The last function I'm going to mention, and this is maybe creeping a little bit into what Jennifer has a little more direct experience with, given her time with the Illinois Pollution Control Board, but it's rulemaking, and I'll sort of present this more from the Illinois EPA's perspective. In the state of Illinois, again, we have the Environmental Protection Act, which is the law that the General Assembly has adopted and was signed into law. Well, oftentimes those statutory provisions need some additional definition or some additional explanation or description as to how those things are going to be met or how those requirements have to be addressed. And so what happens then is regulations or rulemaking will be initiated to enhance, to fill out, to complete whatever that law is saying on its face. In Illinois, for what we call substantive environmental regulations, which is the regulations that go towards the substance and the subject matter of the Environmental Protection Act, those are rulemakings that are presented to, considered, and adopted by the Illinois Pollution Control Board. In many cases, in most cases, the Illinois EPA is the agency, the entity that proposes those rules to the Pollution Control Board. In Illinois, you don't have to be an agency. Anybody can propose a rule to the Illinois Pollution Control Board, but more often than not, it's the Illinois EPA because they are the agency that in the end implements and applies those those regulations. They have that relationship with US EPA. Again, many of the regulations, just like the laws, are federally derived, and so they are in a good position to present that proposed rule to the Pollution Control Board. Some of the rules that are presented are what are called identical in substance, which means, for example, hazardous waste regulations. If there are federal regulations that are in place, the state may say, we don't really have anything to change. We're not going to go beyond that. So we are simply going to present to the Pollution Control Board, here are the federal rules. We want to adopt them at the state level so that we have them on the state books, and so we can put them into our state permits and we can enforce them in state court. Sometimes you have state-only rules, and those might be situations where there is no federal regulation and the state is stepping in and they are filling in a gap or they are addressing a specific state need. And there's some provision in the Environmental Protection Act that addresses some activity or some function that is not addressed in federal law. And so once that law is in place, oftentimes you need some rules to help explain exactly how that law is going to be implemented. And there again, in terms of engagement opportunities, the Pollution Control Board, after they receive that proposed rule, they will conduct a number of opportunities for outreach. They will conduct hearings. They will issue proposed orders and final orders. The proposed order and the hearing both allow opportunities either for in-person or for written comments. The Pollution Control Board certainly takes those into consideration as they develop the rules. So there's another opportunity for any member of the public to participate in that process and to make any comments they want to make in terms of what they feel about those regulations. Do they think they make sense? Do they think they go too far? Do they think they don't go far enough? The last topic I'm going to touch on is, again, within the Illinois EPA, the office that actually does the public outreach. And this is the office that would be most commonly the group of people that would be interacting with the public. And that's the Office of Community Relations, or OCR. They are specifically and solely tasked with serving as the liaison for the agency with the public. They work very closely with the agency's technical staff, with the legal staff, and then interact with the public to provide answers to questions, to facilitate meetings, hearings, workshops, conferences, things like that. They maintain, if you get onto the internet and you just type in Illinois EPA public notices, you will find the webpage that has all of those notices. You'll find fact sheets, you'll find other pieces of information that are funneled through the Office of Community Relations that again are the means by which the Illinois EPA provides information to the general public and allows for that back and forth and facilitates that discussion and that opportunity for discussion. Those are the subjects I wanted to talk about. Again, I know that there's a lot that goes into this that we weren't able to touch on, but I think that gives a good overview as to the general steps and the general opportunities at the state level for participation.
John, thank you very much. Jen, we're going to turn to you now. We have received a few more questions, but again, after Jen's comments and remarks, we'll turn our attention and get to those questions, as many as we can. Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for having me. I'll try to make up for some time and skip over the things that Rhett and John have already talked about. But as John was saying, we have an Illinois Environmental Protection Act. He has covered the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. And I'll focus a little bit on the Pollution Control Board and then go into some local government information. The Pollution Control Board is a state agency that has 5 board members that are appointed by the governor. It has offices in Chicago and Springfield. They have monthly public meetings. So anybody can go to their public meetings. They have an agenda that they post in advance, and you can look at that agenda every month and see if there's something on there that you would like to, hear about or participate in. The Pollution Control Board's website is one of the best websites, I think, in local government, local or state government, in that every single document that has been filed at the Pollution Control Board in any case is available for free on their website. Unlike any of the courts that we practice in here locally, where you have to pay or it's a difficult system, the Pollution Control Board's dockets are free. And then they have a feature on there also, here are the last number of documents. I'm not sure if it's 50 or another number that have been filed. So you can see which cases are sort of active today if you go on their website. And then they will tell you that there's a hearing on a particular case, and you can go to that hearing. Or on a particular permit appeal. If you care about that permit, you can go to that hearing. Or if there's a rulemaking hearing that's being set up, you can go, and it's all on their website. It's really easy to find. John touched on this a little bit, and there's a lot of overlap between the two agencies and a lot of coordination between the two agencies. But in general, the Pollution Control Board handles a variety of cases, but sort of the two major buckets are enforcement and rulemaking. Anytime that board is making a decision, it has to be a majority vote of those 5 members. It happens in an open hearing, and they will write a lengthy decision as to why they've done what they've done. So focusing on enforcement for a second, John already mentioned this, but any individual can file a complaint. They tend to be filed by Illinois EPA and some local governments and some others, but individuals can file a complaint. A lot of the individual complaints that get filed, for example, are noise complaints. That's sort of a big thing that happens at the Pollution Control Board. Environmental groups are another sort of public involvement that happens at the Pollution Control Board. So if your issue has been taken up by one of the environmental groups, the Sierra Club, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, the Southeast Environmental Task Force, El Viejo. There's a dozen or so groups that might be filing at the Pollution Control Board, and you might be able to find friends that already have your issue. I think it's important to mention what kind of relief can you get if you file at the Pollution Control Board. Now, the Pollution Control Board is enforcing the Environmental Protection Act that John already talked about. So it can only do the things, that are listed in there. And the types of relief that the board can grant are something like a cease and desist order, telling the polluter, stop doing that thing. And then there's some civil penalties, but those monies go to the state of Illinois. So even if an individual is stepping in to enforce the Illinois Environmental Protection Act, that money doesn't go into your pocket, it goes to the state of Illinois. And so if you have a problem that's more like I got hurt from some pollution or my property got hurt, that's not going to happen at the Pollution Control Board or under the Environmental Protection Act. That happens. That's a different type of case that would happen in state court. Another thing that the board does is it hears something called administrative citations. So this is for smaller cases, and it happens faster. It's more like a parking ticket or a traffic ticket that is a faster process that can be used by Illinois EPA or more commonly by local government. And so I don't see Chicago or suburbs filing that much there because they have their own administrative process that I'll talk about. But a lot of outside the Chicago area, local governments will file this type of case. On the rulemaking side, again, John covered this a bit, but the Pollution Control Board is where all the rulemaking happens. It is usually, I agree with John that it's usually proposed by the agency, but anyone can do it. I agree with that also. And the public can be involved. And the Pollution Control Board takes public comments really seriously. They address them all in their lengthy opinions. You can testify if you have a position on a rule, and it's a very public process. So I'll move on to local government then. And so we're sitting here in the Chicago area, so I'm going to start with the city of Chicago. There are environmental functions and environmental lawyers at a lot of different city agencies. There is something currently called the Department of the Environment. It was disbanded for a while in 2011 or 2012 and only recently reestablished. And so it's still in their little ramp up period to move staff back over and find money and things like that. So I don't know the exact status of that. When I tried to look up how many employees who were moved over to the Department of Environment, it looked like in the teens. It looked like some of the inspectors had been moved back over to the Department of Environment. They had been in public health for these intervening years. So that's I'm not on the ground there. I don't know exactly what the status is, but they're trying to reestablish the Department of Environment. When I worked at the city of Chicago, there was a Department of Environment still, and I've been elsewhere, during those intervening years. There are environmental functions though at several departments. Streets and sanitation, handling the garbage. They have enforcement mechanisms for when they see garbage in the wrong place. They also do a lot with things like high weeds and have you cut the grass and things like that. So they are out issuing tickets for that sort of thing. The Water Management Department also has a role. They are distributing our drinking water and they are taking away your sewer water. And so they have a lot of environmental things going on there as well. And there's probably others that I'm missing. But the point is that you have to think about sort of what is my problem. It might be in any one of a number of departments. I'll mention Cook County, since both Evanston and Chicago are located in Cook County. Cook County does have an environmental department also. It's called the Department of Environment and Sustainability. And so it's mostly operating outside of Chicago because Chicago is a home rule entity and sort of does its own thing. And then Cook County is helping the suburbs. And then we have another regional entity, the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, which is a government body. We elect the board members to that if you live in Cook County. And those folks handle the treatment of our wastewater. So City of Chicago, for example, delivers it to the MWRD to be treated and then discharged. And so I'll pick up on the FOIA point that Rhett and John talked about. You could FOIA any of these people. And you have to direct your FOIA request to the specific agency. If you have a question that you think might be covered by 3 of them, then you have to submit three FOIA requests. And the local government is following the Illinois FOIA Act. It applies to them the same way that it applies to state agencies. So I teach law school and graduate school, and I use this chart as a refresher. And I think we could kind of wrap up here with one of my main points and advice to folks that are listening is that there are environmental functions all over government. And when you think about what your problem is, you need to think about which level of government might help me with my problem and which branch of that government, because there's environmental things happening in all. So Rhett addressed the federal or United States level of government. John addressed Illinois, and I addressed Cook County and Chicago. And so the environmental agencies that we've all talked about are all in the executive branch. Now, those executive branches are applying the law in the legislature that applies to them. So Illinois is doing the Illinois Environmental Protection Act. United States is doing its federal statutes. Cook County is implementing its ordinances. Chicago is implementing its ordinances. So when you get frustrated about trying to figure out who is going to help me with my problem, it can require some research to figure out, which level of government is touching my issue and what is their authority as given to them by their legislature. And then I will also give a pitch for FOIA. It's already been covered. The only thing I'll add is that I submit FOIA requests several times a week to all levels of government. And I agree that you should start out by being nice and not combative. And the back and forth with the FOIA officer can be really helpful. And I'll stop there so that we have time for questions.
Okay. Jen, thanks very much. I appreciate it. We do have a couple of questions here. I'm going to start with the first one, and if we could, I would ask the panelists to keep your responses as brief as possible because we've got several questions and only a couple of minutes. But the first question we received is, I'll just throw it out. Do any of you have thoughts on the construction of data centers in Illinois and resistance to their construction? I invite somebody to jump in on that.
Well, all I can say is that there's a real life example of that in Chicago on the south side, the former U.S. Steel Southworks facility. And obviously it's going to bring a lot of jobs. I think the press that I've seen about it has been surrounding some engagement with on community benefits agreements with the developers. There are certainly a lot of jobs in the short term that are created. There are some environmental stresses that are also created at the same time. So we're going to kind of see, I think one important lesson, I think, is to engage with the community early on what they want to see out of that, to the extent that that's happening in their area.
Okay. The next question, thank you, Rhett, and I'm sorry to rush through these. How can we learn as a community resident, how can we learn what the most pressing and big environmental issues are?
Paul, Rhett, I would suggest, Jennifer mentioned, there are a number of very engaged, very dedicated environmental advocacy groups, nationwide, certainly, but also based specifically in Illinois and focusing on Illinois-related issues. And they all have websites, they all do press releases, they all have a lot of public engagement. They certainly do a very good job of identifying potential issues of concern and offer opportunities through their respective organizations for participation, for engagement. And I think, just you can also see a lot of issues at the federal level. You make your way down to the state level and local level. And so just doing some I don't want to do too much online research because, you have to sort of filter through the muck, but you can get a sense of the relevant issues that way as well.
John, I'm going to let you take the next question too. The question is the local EPA, I take that to mean IEPA, still being funded? And do you have enough staff? What's your thought on that, having been the director for many, many years?
So as to whether or not they're being funded, yes. Now, the Illinois EPA is a very interesting state agency in the sense that they do not take any money from the state budget. There's a big pot of money called the General Revenue Fund, or the GRF, and that's what funds almost all state agencies with the exception of a small handful. The Illinois EPA is one of the state agencies that does not take money from the General Revenue Fund. So they don't take state budget money. And the way they have their budget is they take the federal money that I mentioned before through the agreements that they have with US EPA to administer those programs. And then they also have money coming in from permit fees. If you submit a permit application, you have to pay a fee. That, as Jennifer mentioned, when there's a lawsuit brought and a penalty is collected, that penalty is divided among several state agencies, including the Illinois EPA. So funding, although that's subject to different swings as well, the reason that the Illinois EPA is not on the state GRF is to try and insulate it from those ups and downs that you often hear about at the state level. As far as staffing, this is a particular point of interest for me because when I became the director for the agency in 2019, one of my biggest concerns was staffing levels because it had been going down over a number of years. When I started at the agency 30-some plus years ago, it was over double the number of people that were working for the state, for the agency when I took the director's position in 2019. So we made a very concerted effort to build those numbers up. And by the time I left when I retired, we'd increased our headcount by approximately 120 people, which for an agency that was only around 600 people at the time when I moved into that position, that was a meaningful increase. So, and since I've left, they continued on that and they continue to push their headcount up. So I do think that at the state level, they are doing very good work in trying to maintain their headcount. They could always take more people, they could always use more money, but I think they're doing relatively well, all things considered.
Thank you, John. Lorena, can we answer the last two questions or do we need to stop?
No, absolutely. I have full control of our webinar right now, and so I am giving you full authority to go right ahead.
Okay. Jen, I'm going to direct the next question to you because I think it's in your bailiwick. Are public notices or hearings required for Illinois to issue permits for building data centers?
You know, I'm trying to catch up with the data center situation myself. I don't know if anyone has had to go to Illinois. My sense of it is, but I could be wrong, is that it's more of a local issue. That it's more of a, you know, how much water are you using? Where are you discharging your cooling water? In the ones I'm familiar with are to the, you know, the local sewer. So you're dealing with the local people. So I don't know whether any of them have risen to the level where they've tried to talk to Illinois EPA. My experience is that it's all at the local level, whatever village or town that they're located in.
Yeah. John or Rhett, do you have a quick comment or supplement to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, certainly if there's something that would trigger a permit, such as a Clean Air Act permit or a Clean Water Act permit, then there would be some involvement. But typically they don't, as Jen was saying.
Rhett, on that front, I'm not sure which of the three, I'll throw it out there, but what are the rules in place regarding private companies bottling and selling Lake Michigan water for their own profit? This reminds me of the ongoing conflict there has been in concern with Nestle, I remember, with water issues, but can someone comment on that?
So there is a fact that all the Lake Michigan states are subject to in terms of that defines how much water they can draw down and regulates what their portion is. And that comes into play when you have communities, for example, like Joliet, that has made the decision in conjunction with a number of other communities to move their water supply away from aquifers and underground wells and instead construct the infrastructure working with MWRD to take water from Lake Michigan. So anytime you have a draw at a municipal level or at a private level, it has to fit within the parameters of what the state of Illinois is allowed to do. And the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is the agency that largely oversees, you know, sort of policing and making sure that the state of Illinois is taking no more than the draw that they're allowed to.
Okay. Very, very good. And I think we've got one final question. In a situation where the permitting authority for a waste transfer station is the state of Illinois, but inspections are delegated to Cook County, does the enforcement authority automatically reside with the county, or does the state also retain its authority?
I will just tell you that in situations, so that the way that happens is there's something called a delegation agreement between the Illinois EPA and that local community. And those local inspectors are trained, they work in conjunction and with the oversight of the state Illinois EPA inspectors, and they will go out and do those inspections. And there will be, again, sort of a financial arrangement that's reached. But if they do find violations, those are not considered local violations, but are considered violations at the state, you know, of the Environmental Protection Act. And because those local inspectors are essentially acting as agents of the state. So those enforcement actions would then be brought through the Illinois EPA.
Okay, very good. Lorena, I'm so sorry that we're running a little bit over, but I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. No problem whatsoever. We love to have the question and answer and the back and forth between our participants and our panelists. We appreciate you all very much for coming in tonight and with all of your knowledge and your background. We do have another request that came in through the Q&A. If any of you would like to email me a list of local environmental groups that you think are reputable and, you know, a good source of engagement for our participants, I'm happy to consolidate those recommendations and email those out to everyone who's registered for this event tonight. I will also be emailing the recording once that's up on our website, as well as your slide presentations with your permission to do so, so that everyone has this information ready to hand. So thank you very much for your participation, and I will follow up with those emails to everyone who registered and attended tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Thanks so much. It was a great opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.